Our Bible word is Philippians 2 verse 8. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So this is Paul writing to the Philippians. And there's debate when and where Paul wrote this from. Some say it was written from Ephesus when he was maybe imprisoned there. That was around 54, 55 AD. But most scholars would say he wrote this from Rome when he was imprisoned there in year 60 to 62. That we can read about at the end of Acts, where Paul makes his journey to Rome and he spent there a period for 2 years in prison. And Paul is writing to the Philippians for various reasons, and also to say, thank you for this gift that you've sent me while I'm in prison. And Paul was very fond of these Philippian Christians, and they also had a very close relationship with him, and they supported him in his troubles, and also during his time of being under house arrest in Rome. So Paul is now coming to a section of the letter where he wants to give exhortation to the Christians of Philippi. And this begins in chapter 1, verses 27. If we go there, it says, only let your conduct be worthy of the gospel of Christ. And the whole area, or from 1 verses 27 to chapter 2 verses 18, is about their conduct that's worthy of the gospel. And initially he pleads for unity in the midst of opposition from outsiders. But this whole area, if we break it down, it's in verse 27, he says there, let your conduct be worthy of the gospel. And then in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, he gives us exhortation for unity and mutual consideration. And then verses 5 to 11, there he uses Christ as the supreme example of humility. And that's also known as the Philippians hymn, that our present Bible word also fits into. And then after that, verses 12 to 18, his exhortation continues. So Paul gives us exhortation to the believers, be mindful of one another, and in the midst of that, he gives Christ as the supreme example of mindfulness, of considering the other. If we go to chapter 2, verses 4, Paul says there, let each of you look out, not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. In other words, have a regard for others, how your behavior, your attitude towards them. And then Paul now in the Philippians hymn, he gives Jesus as the example. And there are a few of these hymns in the New Testament. And of course, they're not hymns like we know it. Hymns back at this time, they were more like creedal statements, or they contain dogmatic content. In other words, this is what we believe. This is the truth. This is, because if you don't believe this, then you can't call yourself a Christian. This is the truth. For Colossians 1 verses 15 to 20 is another Christian hymn, and making also important dogmatic statements. In other words, statements of doctrine. And that's exactly what we find here in verses 5 to 11 in the Philippians hymn. It gives doctrine. It gives dogmatic teaching in terms of who Jesus was, what he accomplished, etc. So those were the functions of early Christian hymns. It was ways to consolidate and formulate teaching, important teaching, and to teach it to the congregation. They probably also sang it in hymns, etc. So what is this Philippians hymn that we encounter in verses 5 to 11? There are two main parts. It speaks of Christ's self-emptying, and that is from verses 6 to 8, and Christ's exaltation by God, that's in verses 9 to 11. Now firstly, if we look there at the left-hand column, first reference is made to Christ's pre-existence, because the author of the hymn speaks of him being in the form of God. So Christ pre-existed before he became incarnate and became a human being. And then also those verses 6 to 8 focus on what Jesus did, his own actions. And what it refers to there in the verse is that Christ emptied himself. Although he had pre-existence, he existed in the form of God, he emptied himself. In other words, to become a human being. And also he took on the form of a slave. We must understand in the background here also is this great fear of free people at the time to be reduced to slavery. In the ancient world, you could become a slave if a foreign nation came and invaded you and they took you captive and they then could sell you off as slaves. You could enslave yourself to pay off debt, but for a free person it was a horrible thing to be enslaved, and because it meant you lost control over your body, over your person. It's your owner, your master had full control over you to abuse and exploit you or use you in any way that he saw fit. So it was a fearful thing. And Paul, in the background is this, that Christ was free, being in the form of God, but he took on the form of a slave. In other words, it's a radical change in status that Jesus experienced by him becoming human. So he took the form of a slave. And he came to exist in the likeness of human beings. In other words, he became a human being. That was his form of slavery. He was up there with God, and now he's a human being. And he humbled himself. I mean, Christ had the status and authority, the highest that you can have, but he humbled himself. This is the example that Jesus set. This is why Paul incorporates this in his whole exhortation. Have regard for one another. Have mutual consideration. Like he says there in verses 4, let each of you look out not for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. Because our example in this is Jesus. How he became a slave. He emptied himself. He humbled himself. And how did he humble himself? He became obedient to death. Even the death of a cross. The cross was a humiliating death. The person who was crucified is humiliated, disgraced, without honor. A complete loser, a nobody. That's what people would have regarded Jesus being crucified. So he was the highest position, and now he became nothing. By becoming human, emptying himself, even dying on a cross, the shameful death of the cross. And this is what Jesus did. Out of his own free will, that's what Christ or the Son of God chose to do. And now the hymn changes its focus because of what Jesus did voluntarily. Now it focuses on what God did. God's now the subject. And it explains that God exalted Jesus to the highest place of honor. And also that he gave him the name Lord. Now Lord, in the Old Testament, especially the Greek translation of the New Testament, it was used to refer to Yahweh. So wherever Yahweh was used in the Hebrew Old Testament, it was translated as Lord in the Greek translation of the New Testament. So that was the name for God, especially for Jews and Jewish Christians. When they read the Septuagint, in other words, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when they read Lord, Kyrios, it referred to Yahweh, in other words, God. And this is the name that God the Father gave Jesus. He's the Lord. He's highly exalted now. So in other words, Jesus is exalted to the highest place of honor because he abased himself. He emptied himself. God exalted him again. And everyone will give him homage. Human beings, angels, whether they are celestial or terrestrial or under the earth, whoever you are, the Greek actually says they will bend the knee. In other words, they will give homage to Jesus and recognize him as Lord. Whether they do so willingly or unwillingly, they're going to do so because this is a state of affairs. This is what is true. Everyone, all angelic beings, good ones and bad ones, all human beings, the good ones and bad ones, will give homage to Jesus and recognize Him as the Lord, as the one who has the highest place of honor, because He abased Himself. So remember, this is part of Paul's exhortation. Consider one another. Because we have Jesus as our example, the supreme example of humility is Jesus Christ. This is what He did. So it's overall part of Paul's exhortation to the Philippians. We must take each other into consideration because Jesus is our example in how we can do this.